Welcome to the first episode of This Week in Cleantech. It's a roundup of the week's biggest stories you need to know in climate and clean energy in 15 minutes or less. Today is Friday, July 21st of 2023. I'm one of your hosts, John Engel, and for those of you who are new to this feed, I'm the Senior Content Director for Renewable Energy World and host of the weekly Factor This podcast. And I'm excited for this new chapter of Factor This, and to be joined by a really good friend and a Cleantech PR veteran, Mike Casey of Tigercomm, for this project. Mike, it's great to see you.
You too, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well. I go into this with no trepidation. I trust you that you won't take my reputation as a respected clean energy journalist, and I think this is going to be a lot of fun. I think it'll be a value add for this audience.
Let's let the record show you're younger, you're better looking, you got more practice on camera, you got more hair than me, so you already start totally advantaged, and I think you can just relax. But hey, this is Mike Casey. I'm your other host, and we put this together because we are expressly trying to give clean techers some time savings here. And the way to think about this is curating what's already curated, finding the things that are significant that really bubble to the top that we think you need to know about, and we're going to try to get it all done in 15 minutes every week. So we're going to rattle off 5 top stories, and then we're going to bring on a journalist who has written or produced one of those stories and talk to them for just 5 minutes in depth about that piece.
Yeah, and we're really excited for the first one, too. David Roberts of Volts is joining us in this first episode, and excited to chat with him in just a few minutes here. And we want you, our listeners, to be engaged as well. So you can nominate stories that caught your eye each week and send those recommendations to ThisWeekInCleantech at Tigercomm.us, and we'll have that link in the episode description as well. Mike, you want to get us started?
Yeah, for sure. And just a note on that, we had several people contact us with news releases, and the news releases are surely important. But to be clear, what we need you to do is send us stories that have appeared in mainstream media and mainstream media podcasts, because we're trying to go not the raw material of clean tech stories, but the ones that have already been curated in some way through the lens of a large media outlet. So that's a standard that we want you to bring them to us on. And just a note on that. So let's get to it here. So our first story is Maxine Joslow compiles an interesting aggregator in the Washington Post every day. Her piece this morning is now Biden's climate law will and won't transform America. And we thought this thing made the cut for several reasons. But John, let me just get your take on the story, and I'll put in my 2 cents.
Yeah, and it's a broad overview of the Inflation Reduction Act, what it does and what it doesn't do. But I do think the more important point here is that a senior politician, very high-ranking politician, and the president is running on a climate and clean energy agenda, which we don't see very often. We have seen it at some levels, but to not a great amount of success. And even after the Inflation Reduction Act, it was interesting to see that the political class that seemingly won that negotiation and that battle wasn't trumpeting it from the rooftops and letting everyone know that this major achievement had just been unlocked, but instead was kind of waiting in the wings to see how the broader market and how the populace would receive it. And just the context around this is that, the IRA is still far from implemented. I talk to developers and asset owners every day who are waiting anxiously for all of this guidance from the Treasury Department around low-income adders and domestic content and how all that is going to impact their workflow. And that big one coming next is low-income adders, and we're hoping to see that in the next few weeks, Mike.
And I'll tell you, John, my thought on this was, I think this is an exclamation point on a paragraph that's going to continue to be written. If you split screen this piece with something 11 years ago when we had this phony cylinder non-scandal, which was followed by $800 million in political ads aimed at President Obama and then Vice President Joe Biden, here's the vice president now as president running for re-election on Bidenomics, and Bidenomics is centered on what he's done for clean energy, and in turn, what clean energy can do for America. And I think it's a sign that this industry is moving in perception into the mainstream of the economy where it has long been in reality. That's why we thought it made the cut here. John, what's story number 2?
We have the U.S. announces first offshore wind rights sale in Gulf of Mexico from Reuters. And this is more big news from the Biden administration and the Interior Department this week. BOEM and Interior setting a date of August 29th for that next offshore wind lease auction, this time in the Gulf of Mexico, with more than 300,000 acres up for grabs offshore Lake Charles, Louisiana, and Galveston, Texas. In total, these areas could generate 3.7 gigawatts and power nearly 1.3 million homes. What do you think about that? That's a pretty big move.
Yeah, I think it's a big move too, John. And I think part of the reason why this made the cut is, if you go back in time and take a look at what the conventional wisdom was on offshore wind when it first surfaced, it was always, the East Coast load centers, even though they're higher priced power, they'll never take offshore wind. It's too expensive. It'll never scale. And here you are having this march from the Northeast to the Mid-Atlantic, now to the Gulf states. And my hope is that Gulf state politicians, who are almost uniformly red, can let go of ideology, look at reality, and see this as a real new power sector, a heavy industry that can create a lot of jobs, and it's not going to spew a bunch of oil off of blown wellheads. So I think that's really that's a real biggie.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add that it's obvious the Biden administration is dead set on hitting that 30 gigawatts by 2030 goal. But to your point about making sure these projects pencil, it is still really, really hard to build an offshore wind project. These are huge construction feats, millions and millions of dollars. And those macroeconomic headwinds that are, plaguing seemingly every industry right now, and even individual consumers with interest rates and just the capital markets writ large, is having a major impact on the offshore wind space. In the Northeast, which was that first mover, we've seen Avangrid is paying $48 million to dissolve a PPA for its 1,200 megawatt Commonwealth wind project offshore Massachusetts with Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. And then another one, South Coast Wind, being developed by Shell and Ocean Winds, is reportedly trying to back out of that PPA with Rhode Island Energy. Rhode Island Energy backing out of another PPA with Ørsted and Eversource for Revolution Wind 2. So there are still some major challenges to make sure that these projects go from that lease auction to actually getting in the water and getting built.
So our number 3 story is from NPR's Julia Simon. It's conservation concerns mean some environmentalists say no to solar projects. And we debated whether or not this should make the cut, because really this is a bit of a niche part of a big problem, because in most development projects at the utility scale for renewables, it's getting built in red areas where conservationists, they don't carry as much sway in the community. But it does, I think, add another facet to the fact that community acceptance is a growing and multi-billion-dollar challenge that we think is probably the biggest barrier to clean energy scaling, because you're asking people in rural areas who don't see climate destruction as a problem, and they don't like the president that's advocating for it, to accept a lot of infrastructure built in. And I don't think the industry has really it hasn't dialed its conversation into the right terms to talk to folks in these areas. But John, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, the push and pull between environmentalists and the clean energy community, it's been going on since the get-go, really. And we know that this is going to persist. I think this story makes a good point that, that objection from environmentalists and other groups with different, ambitions, it can delay projects at the locality level and at the smaller scale level. That the broader permitting fight largely takes place at the state and federal level, but this can still make deploying projects really tricky, cumbersome, more expensive, extend timelines. So it's not something to overlook. And the other piece is we have to make sure that we fulfill the promises that we make to these communities, because we are seeing mounting legal cases involved with stormwater runoff from projects. Those are popping up more and more. Silicon Ranch recently with a high-profile settlement with a landowners in Georgia over runoff issues there. So the environmental aspect of siting and operating these projects is still crucially important. So we can't just look at this as the environmental community being a thorn in the side of clean energy developers.
Yeah, and I'll add this point to this story, and that's that I think that the environmental community is finding its way, like a lot of other constituencies in the country, it's finding its way to a new relationship with there's a lot of facets of the energy transition that are not going to be environmentally friendly, like lithium mining. If we're going to do lithium batteries, we're going to pull a lot of lithium out of the ground. Mining is messy. You can try to limit the damage as much as possible, but as a former professional environmentalist, I understand those concerns, and yet global climate destruction is the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced. And I think that a lot of folks in different constituencies in the country are going to have to right-size their relationship to what we absolutely need to do to get global temperatures back down. So, John, what's our fourth story?
Yeah, our fourth story is new land grab by oil giants is deep underground. That's from Fred Dvorak at Wall Street Journal. And this is one you flagged, Mike, so I'll set it up for you and then kind of toss it over for some perspective. The big oil companies are bidding for leases to store CO2 underground in places with the right geology for carbon sequestration. They've already leased or are proposing to lease around 480,000 acres of land for CO2 storage in Texas and Louisiana. But it's pretty new. Only 4 CO2 injection wells have been issued permits now in the U.S., although nearly 100 are under review. Many companies, circling federal tax credits that were passed last year. What do you think this says about the broader goals and priorities from the big oil and gas industry as it relates to clean energy and climate?
I think our team was struck by a really big point that emerged from the story. And there's been a big question hanging over the clean energy transition. What will the relationship of the oil majors be to this transition? Up until recently, it's been uniformly hostile, obfuscating, greenwashing, etc. The European oil majors have begun to pull away, led by BP and Shell, a little bit by Total. But to us, this story raised again the question, particularly for the domestic oil majors, are they ever going to be anything other than a greenwashing machine? Like, are they actually going to put real capital proportionate to their resources behind the clean energy transition and become part of it as opposed to being an oppositional force, which to date, that's kind of all they have done. So that's why we thought this story was kind of the biggest. And yeah, John.
Well, just the last point, you say oppositional force. That can come in a couple of ways. One can be pure opposition. The other can be through appeasement by doing these little projects here or there, saying, here we're doing our part. Look at the millions we're spending here, but the billions and billions we're spending elsewhere in fossil assets. I think that's key here.
And our fifth one is a podcast, and it's an episode of the Volts podcast by David Roberts, who's going to join us in a second here. And with that, we're going to bring David Roberts on, talk to us about a story for a few minutes. David, thanks for joining us on This Week in Clean Tech. Tell us about what attracted you to this story, and what should clean techers, our audience, take away from the episode?
Well, it's significant for a bunch of reasons. I mean, the most narrow one is people have been talking about enhanced geothermal for decades now, for 50 years now. So the idea is, traditional geothermal, you go and find places where there are natural fissures in the rock underground, which are creating heat, and you jam water through it. The water heats up, you use the hot water to run a turbine, which is great if you can find those natural features, which are geographically limited. There's a ton in Iceland, there's a ton in California, but not enough to be a major player in global power. So what enhanced geothermal is the idea of, what if we could create our own fissures in the rock? What if we could create these features by drilling down and cramming water down under high pressure and fissuring the rock? So they've been trying to do this. They've been doing enhanced geothermal sort of tests, since the 1970s. But the crucial breakthrough, as John said, is taking innovations from the oil and gas industry, from fracking, from gas fracking. So you go down and then you go horizontally for hundreds and hundreds of yards. So what you can do then is create fissures in the rock, serial fissures in the rock, a bunch of fissures in the rock, so that the water has more surface area to touch and longer time to heat up. That makes the economics work. And so so people have been talking about that for a long time too. And so what Fervo has finally done is pass all the tests. They finally passed their production well test, and they now have a commercial power plant up and running. And with that, it's basically the starting gun for enhanced geothermal to start spreading now. And it is an absolute Swiss Army knife for the power sector. It is what everybody needs and wants, which is a reliable, always on, clean form of power that can work in concert with variable wind and solar to sort of balance them out, even them out. So they have dozens of PPAs signed now already in California, because California's, as I'm sure your listeners know, is facing this duck curve problem where wind and solar come on and then they go off. And then when the sun goes down, they have to ramp up all this gas power basically to compensate. And this is the first sort of tool to have a clean version basically that operates the way natural gas can operate. And that's just a fundamental change in the power sector. I think it's going to be absolutely huge.
David, we got about 30 seconds left here. So John, why don't you take the question, then we'll probably got to close this episode out.
Yeah. David, what I thought was interesting about this announcement was Fervo gave us just enough to chew on, but left us, waiting for that additional information about cost and what it'll take to get this technology to scale and broad market adoption. Did Tim give you any idea on what the next step would be for Fervo and how they can take this demonstration plant and really, jumpstart what has been a bit of a stagnant industry?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most fascinating aspects of this for the sort of true energy nerds out there is the problem with geothermal in the past is it's been very bespoke. Every project is different. It requires its own sort of seismicity analysis, its own drilling, its own sort of. So what they're trying to do at Fervo is standardize a lot of these pieces, standardize the wells, standardize the pipes, standardize the methods. And as we know, if you can make these processes more modular and repeatable, then that's what gets you on learning curves. That's what starts reducing prices. So Fervo is very explicitly trying to modularize and standardize this process. So the more plants they build, I mean, they have a long runway of reduced costs ahead of them, and that's explicitly part of their strategy.
David Roberts, thank you so much for joining the first episode of This Week in Cleantech, and that interview with Tim Latimer should be live on all podcast platforms now, so everyone listening to this should then jump over as soon as we wrap up and check that out.
Thanks, guys.
Well, we're about out of time for our first episode of This Week in Cleantech. Please sign up, give us feedback, and start those story suggestions. We want this to be a valuable time-saving part of your week. And I want to give a shout out to Brian Mendez, our wonderful producer, and to Claire Quirin and Alex Peterson for helping us pick stories. But ultimately, we're going to rely on you, our audience, to bring us the stories that you think make the cut, the top 5 for the week. Keep those suggestions coming. John, my friend, this has been fun.
Yeah, and last note too, each week we will publish a column on Renewable Energy World that'll follow this outline and show you all those stories, some context around them, and the links so that you can follow along with us. We'll see you next week.